Now we're going to have a look at the autonomic nervous system. This is part of the nervous system that you don't have conscious control over. It generally will bring about homeostasis within the body. It controls a lot of the resting state and resting activities of the body, but it can kick your body up into an enhanced, increased state of activity as well. I don't recall where I got this drawing from, but I think we can appreciate this. I don't know about you guys, but this is kind of how I'm feeling at the moment. The nervous system, as we've discussed at length, can be broken down into two broad divisions. We have the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is everything that hangs off of that. We're going to focus on the peripheral nervous system. We can take that and we can divide that into two broad categories. We have the somatic nervous system, and this is the system that you have control over. This communicates with sense organs and also with voluntary muscles. So you're consciously aware of what is happening within the somatic nervous system. Then we have the autonomic nervous system. It communicates with internal organs and glands as well, but it does stuff that you don't have control over. Within the somatic nervous system, remember that we have sensory or afferent inputs, and then we have motor or efferent outputs. In the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic division, which is going to heighten activity in the body. And then we have the parasympathetic division, which is going to calm the body. It's going to bring it back down to a resting state. Now I've edited this diagram and I've added in the enteric system, which is generally considered part of the autonomic nervous system, although it is left out in a lot of diagrams, unfortunately. I don't remember where I got this from either. I should probably cite my sources. Anyway, the enteric division of the autonomic nervous system is responsible for maintaining digestion, maintaining the activities of the digestive system. I quite like this diagram here, and it comes from the Journal of Nature. You can't get much better than that. At the bottom here, we have the enteric nervous system, and this diagram does a good job of showing its place in the nervous system as a whole. So it has inputs that come from the sympathetic system, it has inputs that come from the parasympathetic system, but it's also self-regulating on its own. And that's what that curved arrow is at the bottom. And we'll come back and talk about the enteric system in a bit more detail in a moment. Right now, in fact, note that we have a plexus of nerves that are embedded within the lining of the digestive system, as you can see in the diagram on the left. So we have this submucosal plexus of neurons, also known as Meissner's plexus. You might recognize that name. We're going to get to that soon when we talk about general senses. That guy did a lot of cool stuff. Anyway, so we have this plexus of nerves that are found within the submucosa of the intestine and the stomach and all of the organs that constitute the digestive system. Now note on the right, what we're seeing here, we have this myenteric plexus, which is composed of interneurons, as is the submucosal plexus. And then we have inputs from the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of connections. Wherever we have interneurons involved, we get to a point where the system can start to make quote-unquote decisions. So it can kind of decide in some ways what happens, and we have these feedback loops that occur. So much of the time, the enteric system is taking care of itself. It's regulating what happens in the digestive system. It's monitoring the chemistry of the digestive system. It's monitoring the pH, etc. And it's making decisions on its own without having to engage your brain or spinal cord. But it can be overridden by the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Is the enteric system actually a brain? Well, not quite. I mean, it's not nearly as complex as your brain or even your spinal cord, but it does do a lot of stuff all on its own. We'll come back to that next term. But for now, let's get into the autonomic nervous system, the rest of it, the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches. Briefly, though, I just want to remind you that the somatic nervous system, the system that you have control over, that you're conscious of, contains these two components. Efferent, which is motor, so think of effect, it's causing an effect. We're talking about signals that are carried away from the central nervous system, and afferent, of course, which is sensory, where we have signals being transported towards the central nervous system. And these terms also apply to the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it regulates the activities of smooth muscle and also cardiac muscle, as we'll see, but not skeletal muscle. It's involved in involuntary and unconscious activities for the most part. Although the activity of the autonomic nervous system can have an impact on the emotions and so on that you're experiencing. If you're feeling anxious, it might be because of the sympathetic nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system that brings about fight or flight responses. Fight or flight. Think about what that means. It means that you are in a situation where you know you have to act. You have to fight or get out of there. And that's going to cause an increase in activity throughout your body, an increase in the amount of energy that's available to cells, for instance, an increase in the rate that your heart beats at and the rate that you breathe at. Then we have the parasympathetic system, which is the system that's generally in control. If you're at rest, this is the system that maintains a resting heart rate and a resting breathing rate. I should mention that fight or flight responses aren't necessarily life-threatening. If you're running to make it to a bus, that's a fight or flight response as well. In that case, of course, you have to increase the amount of oxygen and the amount of nutrients that are available to your muscle cells, your skeletal muscle cells, so that they can get you to the bus in time. Some organs have innervation from just one of these systems. The adrenal gland would be a good example. But some of them have dual innervation. That means that we have nerves from both systems that connect to that organ. The heart, the lungs, those would be good examples. Most organs receive dual innervation. They have sympathetic innervation that will excite them, and they have parasympathetic innervation that will keep them at a resting state. And the hypothalamus regulates the balance between these two systems. Really, is there anything the hypothalamus can't do? Now, some organs only have sympathetic innervation, and I mentioned one of them before, the adrenal medulla. Now, that releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And it's either releasing it or it's not releasing it. And that's a common theme. So organs that have only sympathetic innervation are organs or tissues that are generally on or off. They don't have kind of a resting state of activity. Their resting state is nothing. Sweat glands would be a good example as well. So sweat glands are going to be releasing sweat or they're not releasing sweat. So if they receive an input from the sympathetic system, they will dump sweat onto your body. If they're not, then they're not doing anything. The erector pili, which are the tiny little muscles that attach to your hairs and erect the hairs, are the same way. So if you're frightened or if you're cold, you're going to receive an input that causes that hair to be pulled upright. Now, if you were a furry animal, like a dog or a cat, and all the hair on your back stood up, that would make you seem rather large and intimidating. In humans, of course, it just tells everyone that you're scared. So these are organs that are usually off. They're only on if they're stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. What brings about sympathetic responses. What kicks the sympathetic nervous system into high gear? Well, we can characterize these as E situations: emergency, embarrassment, excitement, exercise. In all of these situations, your cells, especially your skeletal muscle cells, need more oxygen and they need more nourishment to do whatever it is they might need to do. This is an alarm reaction or fight or flight response, and it typically includes dilation of the pupils. So the pupils are going to open up, they're going to let in more light so that you can see a bit more and maybe better assess what's going on. Incidentally, if you're in a bar and you're looking at an attractive woman or man and you're chatting them up, one thing to note that if their pupils are dilated, it probably means they're kind of excited by the situation, and well, take that as you may. Anyway, we also have increased heart rate and increased force of heart contraction, increased blood pressure. If there's increased blood pressure, then we have more oxygen and more nutrients seeping out of the blood vessels at the capillary bed into the interstitial fluid and potentially into cells that need that stuff. Your body is also going to redirect blood flow away from non-essential organs. And in a fight or flight response, digestion, which is a very long-term activity, is deemed kind of non-essential at the moment. There's more important stuff to do. And that's why if you're up in front of a class and you're giving a speech, or you're embarrassed or you're uncomfortable in some way, blood is being directed away from the digestive system towards your skeletal muscles, and that leaves you with kind of an empty feeling in your gut, which is what the whole butterflies in your stomach thing is. Also, we're going to have dilation of the vessels, the trachea and the bronchioles and the finer vessels that lead into your respiratory system, so that you can take in more air, and your respiratory rate is going to increase. Blood glucose level is going to increase. Your liver is going to release glucose so that more glucose is available to the cells that might need it. Now, this is a response that takes a little while to go away, and that's because it's regulated by the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine, and they need to be removed from the synaptic cleft. That takes a little while. So if you get very excited about something, if you're running for a bus, if you're exercising heavily, it takes a little while for your heart rate and your breathing rate and all the other stuff to drop back down to normal, because all of those neurotransmitters and those hormones need to be broken down and removed from your system. Parasympathetic responses are going to establish a rest and digest state. So digestion happens at its greatest rate when you're resting. And that makes sense because digestion requires a lot of blood flow, for instance. We have these massive capillary beds that are associated with the digestive system so that they can soak up nutrients. And that blood, during a sympathetic response, could perhaps better be used elsewhere. So your body will redirect that blood because it senses that you're going to have to fight or flee, and your muscles are more important if that's the state that your body is in. But the parasympathetic system will maintain these resting homeostatic states. Normally, it's going to be the most active system. The sympathetic system is going to be quiet. It's not doing anything. But note that if the sympathetic system kicks in, it will override the parasympathetic system. So in my statement there where I say it's normally dominant over sympathetic impulses, I mean it's usually active, but the sympathetic system will dominate the parasympathetic system if they're both active at the same time. The sympathetic system will shut down the parasympathetic responses. Sometimes it's stated that the parasympathetic responses bring about SLUD type responses. salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, defecation, and if you wanted to add another D, decreases, decreased heart rate, decreased diameter of airways, decreased diameters of pupils. So maybe that's helpful to help you remember this. So typically, if you're in a very excited state, the sympathetic system is very active. That means the parasympathetic system has slowed down quite a lot. It's not doing a whole lot. You're going to find it hard to do any of these things: salivate, lacrimate, urinate, digest, or defecate. In fact, this is one of the tests that is often used in hospitals to see if someone is feeling okay enough to go home. Let's say someone comes into a hospital and they've suffered a rather traumatic event. What they'll quite often do is they'll ask the person to produce a urine sample before they leave the hospital and go back home. Now, the reason for that is twofold. I mean, the urine might be useful, you might want to test that, but also if they can produce urine, then that means their sympathetic nervous system is not overriding the parasympathetic nervous system. So let's say someone has an operation or someone has an accident. Those are very stressful events. If they can produce urine, then they're not in this sympathetic or shock response. The parasympathetic and sympathetic systems don't differ only with respect to the activities they cause. They differ with respect to how the nerves are structured and how the organs are innervated. With the parasympathetic system, we're dealing with cranial nerves and also a few sacral nerves. So remember that cranial nerves are nerves that originate within the cranium. They come directly off of the brain. We have some sacral nerves as well that are going to influence activities of the bladder and the genitalia. The sympathetic nervous system is quite different. In this case, we have spinal nerves that travel a short distance to ganglia that are found within a chain just outside of the vertebrae. Remember that a ganglion is a structure that houses a collection of neuronal cell bodies. Sympathetic signals don't originate within the brain, they originate within the spinal cord. And they travel out to these ganglia that run in a chain along the side of the spinal cord, less than a centimeter away. This is known as the vertebral chain, or the sympathetic chain ganglia, or the paravertebral ganglia, if you want to call them that. Para means beside, think of parallel. So this is a row of ganglia that run parallel to the vertebral column. We have other ganglia as well, so located a little bit further away, but still within a few centimeters of the spinal cord typically, we have what are called prevertebral or collateral ganglia. And this would include the celiac ganglia, the superior mesenteric ganglia, and the inferior mesenteric ganglia. Let's compare these two divisions. The sympathetic nervous system is shown on the left and the parasympathetic is shown on the right. So let's start with the sympathetic. The sympathetic is going to send out signals, action potentials, from T1 down to L3. So note that we have neurons that have their bodies within the spinal cord, and they're sending out signals to this chain of ganglia that aren't very far away from the spinal cord. Within the ganglia, we have new neuronal cells. The bodies of the cells are located there, so we have synapses there, and they're going to send off signals to the affected organs. Now, in some cases, the signal is going to go directly to that effector, so it might go directly to the salivary glands or to the intrinsic muscles of the eye or to the heart, whatever. Or, as you can see in the lower part of the body, we're going to have axons that lead to a second set of ganglia, the celiac, the superior and inferior mesenteric ganglia. Compare that to the parasympathetic system. Big difference here is that we have axons that are very long. They have to travel quite a long way before they get to the organ or before they get to a ganglion. So we have these axons that come off of the brain directly. Cranial nerve number 10, or X in Roman numerals, is the best example. Remember, this is the vagus nerve. Vagus means wanderer, vagabond. It travels a huge distance. This nerve contains a bundle of axons that come off of the brainstem and travel down to the chest and travel down to the abdominal cavity. We also have nerves that come off of the sacral region, and they travel a great distance as well. So we don't have this chain of ganglia that are located very close to the spinal cord. As you know, any spinal nerve is going to be connected to the spinal cord by two roots. We have the dorsal root and we have the ventral root, or posterior and anterior root if you prefer. We have inputs coming along sensory neurons through the dorsal root. And remember that that little swelling within the root, known as the dorsal root ganglion, is where the bodies of those neurons are found. These inputs are going to be carried into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and if we're dealing with a really simple monosynaptic reflex arc, those sensory neurons will synapse directly with somatic motor neurons that will carry signals out through the ventral root back to the spinal nerve. Now there may also be interneurons involved, as you can see in this example. We haven't talked about the lateral horn though. The lateral horn, so this is a mass of gray matter, only exists within the spinal segments that give rise to sympathetic autonomic neurons. We have the cell bodies of these neurons living within that lateral horn, and then axons come off of those cells and travel along the ventral root with the somatic motor neurons and out to the spinal nerve. When they get out to the spinal nerve, they can continue onto the affected organ or onto a ganglion or onto the chain of ganglia that run parallel to the spinal column. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. So we have our spinal nerve, we have our dorsal and ventral roots. You can see that we have these sympathetic ganglia that are running parallel to the vertebral column. We also have what's called a dorsal primary ramus at the top right there. I haven't talked about that, but that's just a branch that leads out to the muscles and skin of the back. So it's a fairly short branch. But let's track the root of these inputs and outputs. So we have sensory inputs that come along the spinal nerve, and they come up through the dorsal root and then into the dorsal horn. Now remember, we might have an interneuron or we might not. And then we're going to have outputs that are going to travel down the ventral horn and then back out along our spinal nerve. And this is a simple reflex arc. Now let's throw in the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic branch of that, is going to originate responses within the lateral horn. Those responses are also going to go down the ventral root and out along the spinal nerve. Now, when they get to these connections here, they can travel back to the sympathetic ganglia. And from there, we can have signals that go both up and down through the ganglia. We're zoomed out a little further here. We're looking at two spinal segments. So you're seeing two pairs of spinal nerves. There's more detail here than I expect you to know, but I want you to get a sense of just how these elements are arranged. So we have the spinal nerves coming off from the dorsal and ventral root. we have this dorsal ramus, which is part of the somatic system, and it leads to the muscles and tissues of the back. Then we have this ventral ramus, which wraps around the chest and the abdomen. In fact, each one of the ribs would be associated with one of these nerves, leading to the muscles in the front of your body. Then, note, most importantly, that we have this chain of ganglia, the sympathetic chain, that run not that far away from the spinal cord, and they're connected to these spinal nerves. This diagram shows a bit more detail on the wiring of these neurons. Again, more detail than you need to know, but I just want to point out, as you can see on the right, that we can have one segment of the spinal cord that ultimately influences several spinal nerves. So note that the signal can pass up and down, and we can have the involvement of several ganglia within the chain, and that can cause the recruitment of several neurons within several spinal nerves. And that'll bring about a larger response in the target structure or organ. When we're talking about the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, we can speak of preganglionic neurons. Those are neurons that initiate within the spinal cord, and then ganglionic neurons. Those are neurons that initiate within a ganglion. Sometimes the axons of the preganglionic neurons are referred to as preganglionic fibers, and the axons that come off of the ganglionic neurons can be referred to as postganglionic fibers. In this diagram, the red lines represent the preganglionic neurons, and the black lines represent the ganglionic neurons, and the dots represent the location of their cell bodies. So the cell bodies for the ganglionic neurons are located within the ganglia. Now notice that for a lot of the segments, we have preganglionic neurons that go all the way to the target organ, or they go to one of these outlying ganglia, not one of the chain ganglia. So in this region here, you can see that all of these preganglionic neurons lead out to the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric or inferior mesenteric ganglia that lie outside of the chain ganglia. And we even have one branch that goes directly to the adrenal medulla without actually synapsing within a ganglion. Now we have lots of connections between the axons, because remember, axons can synapse with other axons in some cases, and you see that happening within the chain ganglia. Contrast this with the parasympathetic system. In the parasympathetic system, we don't have chain ganglia, and instead the preganglionic neurons have very long axons. They travel all the way to the target organ. There may be ganglia that are embedded within the walls of the organ. Those are referred to as intramural ganglia, or there may be ganglia that are located quite close to the organ, known as terminal ganglia. And these ganglia are actually closer to the organ than it would appear in this diagram. We have the ciliary terminal ganglion, we have the pterygopalatine terminal ganglion, we have the submandibular, and we have the otic. Let's expand on this and take a look at a few other differences between these two systems. For the parasympathetic system, the preganglionic neurons are going to originate from nuclei within the brain or within spinal cord segments S2 to S4. For the sympathetic system, we have these neurons that originate within the lateral horn of spinal cord segments T1 through L2. The ganglia that are going to be innervated by these preganglionic neurons are found within the organ or very close to the organ that's going to be served by the parasympathetic system. With the sympathetic system, we have ganglia that are located within a few centimeters of the central nervous system. The relative length of the pre- and post-ganglionic fibers differs as a result. So for the parasympathetic system, we have long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. So again, postganglionic refers to the axons leading away from a ganglion. And for the sympathetic system, we have the opposite. We have short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. The rami communicantase is responsible for communicating signals between the spinal nerve and between the chain ganglia. So of course those don't exist in the parasympathetic system, but they do exist in the sympathetic system. The parasympathetic system has minimal branching, so the nerves follow a fairly direct route to the target organ, whereas we have extensive branching within the sympathetic system. And as you saw, we can have signals being carried up and down those chain ganglia. The roles are different, as we've talked about, and as we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. The parasympathetic system is going to maintain homeostatic rest and digest activities, whereas the sympathetic system is preparing the body for activity. The neurotransmitters differ. So within the parasympathetic system, we only have acetylcholine, ACH. And in the sympathetic system, the preganglionic fibers are going to release acetylcholine, but the postganglionic fibers are going to be releasing norepinephrine for the most part. Just to summarize that again, with the sympathetic nervous system, we have a very short distance between the spinal cord and the ganglia, so we have short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. And of course, the opposite is true with the parasympathetic system. We can have some axons that are incredibly long, like the axons that make up the vagus nerve. Let's talk in a bit more detail about the outcomes, the effects of these two systems. And I've talked about some of these before, but I haven't touched on all of them. The parasympathetic system is going to constrict the pupil, whereas the sympathetic system is going to dilate the pupil. The parasympathetic system is going to stimulate saliva production, so that's part of the digest part of this system. It's getting you ready to digest food. The sympathetic system, on the other hand, is going to inhibit saliva production. So if you're very anxious or frightened, you might get kind of cotton-mouthed or dry-mouthed. The parasympathetic system is going to constrict the bronchi, whereas the sympathetic system is going to dilate the bronchi so that you can move a bit more air into your lungs. The parasympathetic system slows the heart, whereas the sympathetic system is going to accelerate the heart rate. It's also going to increase the contractile force of the heart. Parasympathetic system is going to stimulate the stomach and pancreas and intestines to do all the things they have to do involved with digestion, whereas the sympathetic system is going to inhibit that and also direct blood flow away from the digestive system. The parasympathetic system stimulates urination, whereas the sympathetic nervous system inhibits urination. And as I mentioned, if you're leaving a hospital and you're unable to provide a urine sample, well, they probably won't let you leave. Even if they don't need that urine sample, they just want to know that you're back on the parasympathetic system and it is now taking control of things. Finally, for the genitalia, this is kind of interesting. Both of the systems have different effects on the genitalia, and it might be something a bit different than what you would expect. So the parasympathetic system promotes the erection of the genitals, which you might think is kind of strange because that's arousal, and you would think that would be something that the sympathetic system would do. Well, the sympathetic system brings about actual ejaculation and contractions of the vagina as well that are associated with orgasm. So once again, with the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons have rather short preganglionic fibers, and the postganglionic neurons have long postganglionic fibers. The change in color in this diagram just indicates that those two neurons are using different neurotransmitters to communicate with the cell that's next in line. The motor neurons of the somatic nervous system use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter, and acetylcholine is by far the most common neurotransmitter within the body, although of course there are others, especially within the brain. The parasympathetic system utilizes acetylcholine as well. So within the synapse between the preganglionic cell and the ganglionic cell, we have acetylcholine, and also within the synapse between the postganglionic fiber and the effector organ, we have acetylcholine. However, for the sympathetic division, we have acetylcholine being used in the first synapse, but norepinephrine being used in the second synapse, the synapse between the postganglionic fiber and the effector organ. Something else interesting happens within the sympathetic division. Remember that the adrenal medulla of the adrenal gland produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal medulla is innervated by the sympathetic division, but not by the parasympathetic division. So this is an example of a tissue that's going to be turned on by the sympathetic system, and if it's not, then it's simply off. So it doesn't have any parasympathetic innervation. If the adrenal medulla receives input from the sympathetic division, it's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. It'll flow to organs, and they can potentially be affected by this hormone as well. So many organs can be affected by epinephrine and norepinephrine that are in the bloodstream or that are transferred across a synapse. Some target tissues have receptors that will respond to norepinephrine. These target tissues would include glands and smooth muscle and so on. These receptors are known as adrenergic receptors. There are two broad categories of receptors for acetylcholine. We have nicotinic receptors, and we also have muscarinic receptors. And as we'll see, they result in different responses in the target cell. The nerve cells that release norepinephrine within the sympathetic nervous system are known as adrenergic cells, whereas the nerve cells that release acetylcholine within the parasympathetic system are known as cholinergic cells. So cholinergic neurons release acetylcholine. This is the case for all preganglionic neurons, whether we're talking about the sympathetic or parasympathetic systems. And it's also true for all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some sympathetic postganglionic neurons that also use acetylcholine, but that's not the norm. Now, the release of acetylcholine can have different effects on target tissue, depending on the receptor type that's present. It can cause inhibition or it can cause excitation. Cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine and their internal membrane proteins. They completely cross the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic cell. And once again, they come in these two flavors, nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic receptors bring about a very rapid depolarization. Essentially, they're a ligand-gated channel. So acetylcholine is the ligand. It binds to this channel that opens up a passage for the influx of sodium, and that's going to rapidly depolarize the cell. So these are fast-acting receptors. We see them in the dendrites of ganglionic neurons. We see them in the hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla, and they're also used within the somatic system. They're found within skeletal muscle cells. Muscarinic receptors, on the other hand, bring about a slow response, and that's because they're not simple gated channels. They don't allow for the sudden influx of sodium, as we're going to see. There's more that has to go on within the cell. And they can result in very different outcomes depending on where they are and how they interact with the pathways, the biochemical pathways within the target cell. So in some cases, we can have these muscarinic receptors that are inhibitory. That's what happens to cardiac muscle. So if acetylcholine binds to those receptors, it slows the beat of the heart. But in other places, acetylcholine binding to a muscarinic receptor will bring about increases in activity. So for instance, within the smooth muscle of the gastrointestinal tract. The activities of nicotinic receptors are pretty simple and straightforward. We have the opening of a gated channel that allows sodium to rush in and we get a rapid depolarization of the cell. Well, for muscarinic receptors, there's a lot more going on and it can be regulated in many different ways. So what's happening here is acetylcholine binds to the receptor and that activates a G protein. And we've talked about G proteins before. Remember, they're internal signaling molecules and they can do a whole bunch of different things. They could, for instance, bind to a potassium channel, allow potassium to leave, and that would hyperpolarize the cell and inactivate the cell. It would make it less likely for that cell to send off an action potential if the cell is capable of that. Or those G proteins could interact with different enzymes and turn them on, or maybe even deactivate them. The G protein could also interact with other proteins that bind to the promoter of a gene and turn the gene on or turn the gene off. So these kinds of receptors can bring about a bunch of different changes within the cell. What happens depends on what molecules are there and what pathways the G protein can interact with. Adrenergic receptors are similar to muscarinic receptors in that the receptor is going to activate G proteins. And once again, there's a whole lot that could happen as a result. So norepinephrine, when it binds to one of these receptors, it could heighten the activity of that cell. That's very common, but it also could inactivate the cell or inactivate parts of its metabolism. Now with norepinephrine, it will continue to bring about a response in the effector cell until it's removed from the synapse. And that takes a little while, and this is why it takes a while for your heart rate to slow after a fight or flight response has been removed. Now also you have epinephrine and norepinephrine in the blood as well, so that may have been released by the adrenal glands during a fight or flight response. That can activate many different targets also. That has to be removed as well. So we have these lingering effects of norepinephrine. As if this wasn't complex enough, the adrenergic receptors, the receptors for norepinephrine, come in two types. We have alpha receptors, and typically they cause stimulation. And then we have beta receptors, which tend to cause relaxation, although there are exceptions. For instance, in heart muscle, it causes the opposite thing. So you can see now that the release of norepinephrine can have very different effects depending on the target cell. It depends on the biochemistry of the cell, what's going to happen when that G protein is activated, and it also depends on which of these two types of receptors is present. Does the target cell have alpha receptors or does it have beta receptors? These alpha and beta receptors are common targets for a lot of different pharmaceuticals. Now what most drugs do is they mimic molecules that you have in your body. They have a similar shape. So for instance, there are drugs that will bind to the active sites of enzymes. They mimic the normal substrate. There are a lot of other drugs that will bind to receptors because they mimic the shape of the signaling molecule that would normally bind to that receptor. We have two broad categories of these sorts of compounds. We have agonists, which are substances that bind to a receptor and activate the receptor. And then we have antagonists, which are substances that bind to the receptor, but they don't activate it. Instead, they block it. So while they're bound to that receptor, the signaling molecule that would normally activate it can't do anything. So if we were to block a receptor within a synapse, it can't respond to any neurotransmitter that's being released into that synapse. It just won't respond whatsoever. So drugs can serve as either agonists or antagonists, and we can block specific autonomic nervous system receptors. Alpha and beta receptors, there's a lot of them, so they can also be divided up into other categories. We have alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors that produce excitation in the target cell. We have alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors that cause inhibition of activity within the target cell. And we have beta 3 receptors that are found in adipose tissue, fat tissue, that stimulate lipolysis, the breakdown of fats in fat cells. And there's a lot more, but these are just a few of the important ones. Beta blockers are drugs that act as antagonists, and they bind to and inactivate beta receptors. So when they bind to a beta receptor, they stop the normal signaling molecule, a neurotransmitter for instance, from binding to that receptor and bringing about a change. Sympatholytic agents are agents that block adrenergic receptors. They are antagonistic to the effects of adrenaline and noradrenaline, remember also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. So because of that, they decrease sympathetic activity. There are beta blockers that will specifically bind to the beta 1 receptors on cardiac muscle. By doing so, they block epinephrine and norepinephrine from binding to the heart muscle and bringing about an increased heart rate and increased power of contraction. And by doing so, they help lower blood pressure. We also have sympathomimetic agents, and no, you don't have to know that term, that can bind to adrenergic receptors and enhance the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So they're going to act as agonists. These agents will activate those receptors and bring about the same change that the sympathetic nervous system would. So for instance, albuterol is one of these agents, and what it does is it mimics the effect of norepinephrine within the lungs. It binds to beta 2 receptors within the smooth muscle that lines the bronchioles, and it relaxes those muscles, because that's what the sympathetic nervous system would usually do to the lung. So those passageways are going to relax and open up and make it easier to breathe. There are also agents that have been used in diet pills, and what they do is they bind to beta 3 receptors within fat cells and encourage them to break down fat. In summary, the sympathetic nervous system prepares your body for an emergency situation. It motivates you, and it makes sure that oxygen gets to all the tissues that require it. The parasympathetic system brings us back down, helps us conserve energy, and also by activating the digestive system, it makes sure that we're absorbing nutrients and absorbing energy. The little diagram here shows you that there is a balance between the two, and this helps us maintain homeostasis. As a biologist that has owned many snakes, maybe I'm a bit weird, but I'd be running towards the snake for a cuddle. And here is our terminology.